Well, good evening, everyone. We have come with this lesson to the end of our special series called The Heart of the Matter. This is lesson 21. We have a statement in English. It's probably a little bit archaic now. We refer sometimes to someone needing an attitude adjustment. And I hope that the lessons that we've been studying over the last few weeks have been just that for all of us, an attitude adjustment. We've looked at our attitudes toward a number of different things in this life, things that we will deal with and face. And there's been something of a progression, though not specifically intentional. But we did begin this study with just some very basic things that we needed to sort of look at properly in order to build the right kind of a life. And if we've done that, if we have really attended to the previous lessons, then tonight's lesson on children should sort of follow. That if we have our attitudes toward God and ourselves and others and Scripture and morality and all the different things that we've talked about, if we have that straight, then dealing with children should sort of come naturally. On the other hand, if our attitudes toward these other basic things in life are askew, if they're not directed properly, then that's probably going to show up in the way that we view and the way that we deal with our children. So again, the subject matter we're dealing with in each of these lessons is way too broad for the time that we have together. But we'll do our best just to introduce some ideas. And again, perhaps these will be a springboard for further consideration and even conversation, perhaps in your family. So let's talk first of all about our broad overview of children and how we should look upon them. I began by saying that one indicator of a society's moral soundness is how it treats the least fortunate among the population, those that would be the weakest, those that are most helpless, and certainly children fall into that category. They enter the world in a very helpless state and remain vulnerable for a very long period of time compared to other non-human animals that are on the earth. And so we have this long process of nurturing children and bringing them to a point of engaging independently in the world in the most effective way possible. And so if it is true that a society can be measured by its treatment of the helpless, then it's very disturbing what we are seeing in our own culture regarding children. On the one hand, children are seen as an inconvenience. They are an intrusion into someone's selfish pursuits, and thus we have extremely high abortion numbers in this country. Children that never actually get a real start on life. They don't see, as we say, the light of day. And this is a terrible travesty and tragedy. It does not speak well. This is not a legal question. It is a moral question. And it does not speak well that some of the best and brightest minds in this country, including the Supreme Court, have judged in favor of ending life in the womb. It's a terrible commentary on where we are morally. But beyond this, there are single women, those without a husband or father figure in the family, homosexual couples who are adopting children to bring some sense of normalcy into their lives or legitimize their relationships. And sadly, I believe this is using children to further one's own agenda. Children are often pawns in divorce battles. One side or the other, or both, are trying to use the children for leverage or to maybe punish the spouse in that separation. Of course, we have way too much verification that children are horribly abused. They're neglected. Their parents are off pursuing their own personal ambitions. And now in our day and time, believe it or not, a growing number of parents are abusing their children through putting them on hormone blockers to suspend their puberty development, and even acquire disfiguring surgery for their children in an attempt to alter gender identity. There are many other things and more grotesque things that we could go into in describing how abused children are in our society by people that do not have even a modicum of morality or spirituality about them. And as we said, this is a sad commentary on how far we have drifted away from God and goodness in our culture. And so we need to somehow come back to some foundational ideas about children, something that should be a matter of natural affection and should come naturally to an adult human being, how to nurture and care for and treat very carefully a child. But again, that's being lost in so many quarters. We need to come back to the idea of investment in children for their sake, not for the sake of the adult, though there are benefits to the adult. But raising children is not just a part-time job. It is not something that we aspire to have children to sort of fill out some sort of cultural standard and appear to have a semblance of normalcy in our lives. When we become a parent, this is a tremendous investment of time, energy, affection, devotion, commitment. We're truly signing on for a lifetime commitment. This is not something that with honor we can get ourselves into and then decide we don't want to do this anymore. That this was more than what we thought it would be, so we want to set those children aside. This is something that doesn't, in one sense, stop in our lifetime. That is, that once we're a parent, we're always a parent to some degree. We will not have control over our children's lives as adults, as we might have when they are toddlers, say. But our concern and our love for our children will never stop because they have become adults, or maybe they themselves have children. When Judah made an appeal to Joseph, before he knew who Joseph was, regarding the retaining of Benjamin, not allowing Benjamin to go back home, I think Judah spoke for all parents forever when he made this statement to Joseph. Since his life, Jacob's life, is bound up in the lad's life, Benjamin's life, it will happen when he sees that the lad is not with us that he will die. Genesis 44, verses 30 and 31. Judah says of Jacob, since his life is bound up in the lad's life. I think that's a wonderful description of being a parent. As parents, our lives are bound up in our children's lives. We want to see them thrive. We want to see them healthy. We want to see them nurtured and growing. We want to see them come to understand and love God. We want to see them be responsible participants in society. We want to see them healthy and strong and able to care for themselves and, yes, be independent from us, because that's the natural order of things. And so as parents, having natural affection, as we should have for our children, all of these things should describe what we want to see in children's life as even our lives are bound up in their lives. So ideally, our children broaden our concerns beyond just ourselves. I have very clear memories of this sort of feeling when my children were young, realizing how much energy and attention that it took to nurture and develop and care for children. I remember distinctly thinking that this is God's way of getting my mind off of myself. And sadly, I think that there are many adults who've never gotten their minds off themselves. I think God does this in a variety of ways. He tries to bring balance to our outlook, to our relations with others, and he tries to distract our attention so much from being focused on ourselves. Children are one of the ways that he does that, but they're a big way. They're such an investment of our time and energy that we're forced to think outside of ourselves and to put our own concerns aside for a particular portion of our lives. And so I believe we mature in self-awareness by giving our time, our love, and support to others who depend on us. Again, this may go beyond children, but it certainly starts there. In this, we become more familiar with God. We see more of how God looks at us, perhaps, how he looks at us as children, how he considers us in our weakness, how he might look upon us in the mistakes that we make, and desiring to see us grow and develop and give us chance after chance to be better. I believe there's all kinds of ways in which we gain insights into God as our Heavenly Father when we consider ourselves as mothers and fathers. Truly, our lives are bound up in the lives of our children. Well, let's talk just briefly, and that's all we can do. These are just very brief overviews of different phases of the lives of children. And when we say the word children or child, we are talking about a variety of phases of life, different courses of development that they will follow. And so the word children covers a large territory, from adult children, as we said, to infant children and everything in between. So let's think about those often crying and demanding little infants. God has seemingly built into them features that evoke our most attentive care. That is, when a baby cries, there's something very irritating on one level about that. And I mean, not being bothered, but eliciting a desire to satisfy what is ailing that child, what it's trying to tell us that it needs on a very primal level. And so I think that sound of a baby's cry is designed to garner action from parents. And we as parents have heard that cry at 2:30 in the morning. And no matter how deeply asleep you were or how tired you were, not having gotten bed till late, that cry will get you out of bed and will try to help you figure out what that child needs. Even the most loving and patient parents can be irritated by and lose patience over a constantly crying child. Again, frustration grows when we're exhausted, when we're emotionally spent, when we're under great stress. And this is where parents need each other a great deal. When one parent has had it with Junior, it's time for the other parent to step in and say, let me hold him for a while. Let me see what I can do. You need to take a break. Just go relax. I'll take care of it. Parenting truly is a partnership. It's a two-party system. And we also need to realize that these phases that children go through that cause us such stress at times, they're pretty much all temporary phases. Now that we've got a little mileage on us, Melanie and I, we can look back and see all of these phases, outlined in our own children's lives. In the moment, it may seem like an eternity. A colicky child may seem like, I am never going to live through this. This is just not going to pass before I lose my mind. And it does. And you're helping each other get through it. And, it gets better. Various phases of life get better along the way. And then when you look back on your grown children and their lives, you realize really how quickly those phases went by. I know it's easy to say that when you're a little bit older, and younger parents may not believe it. It was hard for me to believe it when older parents would say, look, this is going to fly by. And it sure didn't seem like it was flying by at the time. But this phase of infant total dependence truly is fast. They begin to learn and react and respond physically and mentally so quickly. And we need to hang in there till they grow out of some of that constant attention that's needed early on. Well, other stages present blessings and burdens, just like the infant years when a toddler discovers his self-will. I I actually can kind of make up my mind what I want to do and not do, and I can push back against what mommy and daddy say, and I don't feel like doing what they say. When they say come here, I don't feel like coming here. When they say it's time to eat, come on, and no, I don't feel like I don't want to play with my toys a little while longer. That self-will can be very, very powerful early on. We refer to the terrible twos, and I think basically that's referring to this self-will coming alive in our children, and they're beginning to push back against authority even early on. And so these very early years of toddlerhood will take an investment of energy and time, molding and shaping that will into respect for authority, into compliance with others, and this is, we're setting them up for a lifelong lesson here. We're always going to answer to some authority. We're always going to have to show respect and submission to authority on some level or multiple levels. And this must be taught beginning in the earlier stages of life. When that will is beginning to be exerted, then the parents must be ready. They must be prepared to start molding and shaping that will for when they first see it defiantly being expressed. And that's a key word, defiant. A child may be ignorant in what they're doing, and we need to respond appropriately. But when a child becomes defiant, knowing what is expected, and they defiantly do something else, then it's time for parents to start acting in more forceful ways. It is gratifying, however, when we work through all of these stages and we mold and shape that child's will to see them then grow up later on in their early to mid-teenage years, and we start seeing them make the right decisions for themselves. It's very gratifying to think of the time and energy we put into helping them understand the responsibilities that they have. Now, other things come with teenage years as well. And these years can be challenging to parental affection, to be quite honest. As a child faces the difficulties, and it is difficult for them to grow to independence. They're learning new things and exploring new things, and there's sort of a draw to that independence, and on the other hand, there's a dread of it, and they don't know how to handle that. But there's likely with every teenager, not the same across the spectrum, but there's likely to be occasions of irresponsibility, rebellion, impulsiveness, other attitudes and behaviors that make parenthood unpleasant, frankly, at times. This is where a parent has to hold tough. And when children start pushing back in their teenage years and giving us grief in one way or another, this is the time to hold steady. And as my wife and I said on many occasions, at that point in life, and I'm sure some will disagree with this, but at that point in life, we're not here to be your friends. We're here to be your parents. We can be friends later. When you grow up and you learn how to interact with people properly, and you learn respect, and you learn to value us as parents, then we can be friends. And I believe we're friends with all of our children at this point in life. But early on, when the molding and shaping and the nurturing is going on, and especially in the teenage years, it may not feel very friendly between parents and children. And that's up to the children, really. I think parents certainly can and must be as friendly toward their children as possible. But as the children push back and challenge and test the limits and the parameters of a parent's authority, parents are going to have to meet that. They're going to have to escalate in order to keep that child under control and demonstrate to that child who is in charge. And sometimes you have to say, almost literally, we'll be friends later, but right now you're going to do what I tell you. You're not going to be disrespectful to us, or whatever the particular challenge may be. And so, these teenage years can be challenging, and I think there are many Christian parents who talk about it among themselves. How do I handle this, and how do I handle that? I found my children doing something secretly behind my back, something I thought they would never do. I never thought my child would do blank. And so these can be very challenging and very difficult years as what we've tried to teach them is being tested. But we love them. Parental love continues, but we patiently try to understand what they're going through, remembering that we were teenagers at one time, but we may not have had the particular problem that our teenage child or children are showing. But I believe that for those of us who are a little bit older, it's not been so long since our teenage years, we've forgotten what that's like. So we might need to go back into that period of our own life and remind ourselves how we felt and why we did some of the stupid things that we did and the senseless things and all of the angst and all of the confusion going on in our minds that caused us to do the most irrational and illogical things. And looking back, we wince and we get embarrassed and our cheeks flush and we think, did I really do that? Did I say that? Yes, we did. And sometimes our children will do that too. But we love them. We nurture them still. We want to continue to mold and shape. We want to be as patient as possible while helping them work through these difficult times. In all phases of our children's lives, we strive to appreciate them as gifts of God. We need to continually look upon them in that way. And if we do, it'll help us through the hard times. All right, so the third section here, let's deal a little bit more specifically with the idea of discipline, because one of the most disturbing trends, in my opinion, in our society is the abandonment of strong discipline in favor of a more permissive, indulgent, hands-off approach to child rearing. You may gather by my comments that we were not that way as parents. Melanie and I were hands-on. There was an authoritative structure in the family. We did make certain demands of our children, though I would not say that the essence of our relationship with our children was making demands, but there were expectations. There was a level of behavior, attitude that we expected our children to meet. And all parents, I think, strive to be fair, to be understanding of their children, to treat children according to the level, the emotional and maturity level that they're on at a given point in time. But we certainly were not parents who were indulgent and permissive. Well, we tried not to be. We did try to hold our children accountable. And we vowed together that we would not simply step in and defend our children and shield them in a matter in which they were in the wrong, that they needed to deal with it. They needed to face the music. And so we tried not to make excuses for our children. We tried to deal with their issues according to the reality of the situation, not according to our idealism or what we felt their behavior said about our parenting skills. And I do think there are a lot of parents that get very defensive about their own children and run interference for them with teachers, principals, the law, perhaps, and make excuses for their children because they take it personally what their children are doing, and they can be embarrassed, and they don't want to be reflected upon poorly, so they blame the authority figures rather than holding their children accountable. And so, according to the very liberal view, the permissive view of raising children, love and discipline seem to be inconsistent. Love and discipline, especially firm discipline, they seem to be at odds with each other, and I suggest that that is just wrong. Love and discipline come together. They harmonize. I believe the Bible teaches that. That when you hear a parent say, I love my child too much to discipline them, they're having cognitive dissonance in their mind. They're seeing a contradiction that isn't there. And we need to learn to deal with that so that we will handle our children the right way. And part of this means making life unpleasant for them on some level. Now, this isn't only about corporal punishment or spanking, though that is quite obviously politically incorrect in our day and time. Any kind of hands-on treatment today is defined by so many as abuse, and I just simply believe that's wrong. But I believe there's only a certain time in a child's life, and I think it can be fairly brief if done correctly, where corporal punishment is an issue. It is a teaching tool only. It is not retributive. It's not to make a child feel bad. It is a teaching tool. It is a shaping and molding tool. It is a way to communicate when nothing else will be as effective in that communication. And so the scriptures tie together love and discipline. And the Old Testament especially goes into detail about the importance of disciplining and correcting. So you see in your notes, I'm not going to read through these. They're short and simple, and hopefully you've read through them before our class tonight. But I've got 7 quotations here from Proverbs, and some might say, well, wait a minute, how come you're quoting the Old Testament for that? Well, let me suggest something to you about the difference between the Old and New Testament. When we look at the Old Testament as a legal document, that is a covenant made between God and the Israelite people. When we think of the regulations, the statutes, the ordinances, the commands that God was issuing to Israel, no, those things are not applicable as the law of Moses. The law of Moses has been done away because Jesus fulfilled it. I did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it, he says in Matthew 5. And he did fulfill it, and he did nail it to the cross. That is, he completed it. There's no more need for the law of Moses as a legal document. However, that is not to say there's no wisdom in the law of Moses. There are too many passages in the New Testament where a New Testament writer upholds a new covenant principle by going back and quoting from the Old Testament. We have literally scores of references and quotations from the Old Testament to establish something in the New. Sometimes things transfer right over very directly. Loving God, for example, or loving your neighbor as yourself. But there are other elements of the law that do not transfer at all. There are certain elements of the law of Moses that have no counterpart whatsoever in the New Covenant. But there is something called, and Proverbs is part of this, something called wisdom literature. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Job. We have these wisdom passages in the Old Testament that give us eternal insights into human principles, human behaviors and motivations, aspects of God, parts of God's character or God's expectations that really are cross-covenantal. It doesn't matter what the covenant is. These are truisms. They're axioms. They're proverbs. And so let us not dismiss these proverbs too quickly, because I do think there is a counterpart in the New Testament in Ephesians chapter 6. But these passages stress disciplining our children, sometimes with severity, but not to abuse and not to cause them any kind of physical harm, but certainly to show firmness and expectation and displeasure with having a child deliberately disobey or be disrespectful, knowingly and willingly challenge our authority. So again, I'm not going to read through all of those, but note how important they are in a child's development. Again, conventional wisdom today says this is barbaric and cruel, and any parent engaging in this would be considered abusive. But our current society is way off the beam in many aspects of child rearing. So I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in Freudian and other modern day psychologists. Their views of human nature change. Their dictionaries of psychological principles and behaviors change regularly. They keep altering them to keep up with the opinions of the times. So I simply wouldn't put much stock in those kinds of things. What we need to do is follow God's word, and we need to be wise about it, and we need to be diligent about it. The opposite actually is true. That is, it's not abuse to hold your children accountable. The opposite is true. To not hold your children accountable is itself abuse. To let a child raise himself, and there are a lot of people in our day and time that are basically advocates of that. Let a child find his own way. It's not for me to impose my will or my views or my worldview on my children, blah, blah, blah. That is neglect. And that is abuse. That will not enable a child to learn what he needs to learn or she needs to learn to function responsibly in society. Children raising themselves is not what God intends for human parents. There are animals in the animal kingdom that pretty much raise themselves. That is not true of humans. And certainly it is not true of the kind of interaction that should take place between a human parent and their human child. We are not the higher rung on the evolutionary ladder. We are created in the image of God. And God commands and teaches us certain things and teaches us how to interact with our children. And love and discipline are part of that interaction. A child that does not receive this will have a more difficult time with their peers and authority figures because they've never learned respect. They've never learned obedience. They've never learned self-control. And I believe also that the pattern of a human parent with their child is reflective of God's interaction with us as his children. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 and 6, the writer says, "My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and scourges every son whom he receives." So here we've got this concept of love and discipline, love and correction. Correction is the outgrowth of love. The outgrowth of neglect, or a lack of love, is neglect. If we don't love our children enough to mold and shape them, if we find it uncomfortable or distressing, we just don't want the hassle of how a child is going to act. If they're disciplined, then we're saying something about ourselves, and it isn't complimentary. Love's outgrowth is discipline. Whom the Lord loves, he chastens. And so we must love our children enough to do what is good and right for them, though it may be uncomfortable, though it may be strenuous, though it may be unpleasant. I don't know of any parent that loves the sound of their child crying in some kind of distress or pain. It is not pleasant, but it is necessary, and it is so rewarding, again, as we see our children grow. And we see them grow up, as comes out in the Hebrews 12 passage, when they grow up to look back and say, yeah, I needed that. I needed my parent to stand up and say, no, you're not going to do that, and you're going to pay for that. I think when we look back, in all honesty, I'm not talking about abuse. There's no expectation to look back on abuse and value it. But when discipline has been lovingly and in a measured fashion dispensed, even a child will recognize the right thing has been done. And a child will recognize when it should have been done and it wasn't done. And so as adults, I think if we had responsible parents, we can look back and say, you know, my dad, my mom, they loved me enough and they cared enough about me to discipline me and try to teach me and help me overcome some of my rebellion. And so these are blessings. They're not signs of abuse or a lack of maturity on the part of a parent. Again, these are very measured responses, usually in regard to corporal punishment, limited periods of time. You know, the principle is stake out your ground. Make it clear who's the boss and who is in charge, who has the authority in the family. If you do that at the outset, then you've won the battle. You won the war. You win the battle early, you win the war. And your children can become very, very pleasant, and the relationship can be very pleasant when you don't have to keep covering this ground and fighting this battle all of the time. Okay, let's move on. Children as spiritual beings, number 4. Ephesians 6:4, this is a New Testament passage where fathers especially, though mothers are not exempt, but fathers are focused on in raising their children. He says, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. As we said earlier, God has so arranged things that human children take a long process to nurture, a long period of time to spend with them and guide them and teach them and correct them and introduce them to more mature behaviors. Again, in the animal kingdom, sometimes parental oversight lasts, days or weeks or months. With some animals, it is years. But humans are very different. We're looking at 17, 18, 20, 22. The age keeps getting higher as our society goes onward. That's not necessarily healthy, but for a variety of reasons we're not going to explore here. But we have a long time with our children. We whose children are gone from the house say it's a short period of time. It goes by fast. But 17 to 20 years is a long period of time to invest in our children. They're mentally and emotionally undeveloped at first, but they are spiritual beings. Our job is to mold and shape, not merely provide for their physical welfare, that's part of it, but to shape the inner person, to mold and shape that and help them mature into a healthy self-image. And that has to do with teaching them about God. And so the challenge of Christian parents is to raise them in such a way that the spirit is nurtured, along with the mind, the intellect, and along with the body. We're trying to make our children spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically healthy as much as we can. Provide good things for them to enable them to thrive and be protected and be at peace and know that they're loved, but yet shown parameters and guidelines and boundaries so that they end up learning to focus properly on life as they mature. Again, consider Deuteronomy 6 through 9. This is a passage well known to Christian parents because it gets preached on and cited in classes like this a lot. Deuteronomy 6, beginning in verse 6, and these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Again, ask yourself, is that only an Old Testament principle? If so, we can scrap a lot of sermons that have been built on that particular verse. No, I think Ephesians 6:4 highlights that very idea. That is, that teaching our children is not about, as we say, the occasional Bible class or worship service. It is not just indoctrination. It's not just opening their head and pouring in the facts that we want them to know. We want children to reason their way into their faith, to think for themselves, to draw reasonable conclusions, even carefully to introduce them to contrary concepts, so that when they get out in the world and they start hearing atheists push back, they're not shocked and at a loss for how to deal with that. It should not be that our children go off to college and they hear atheists pushing back and they say, I've never heard this argument before. Now, it may be that there's a specific argument that's new, but we also, in nurturing and raising and teaching our children, need to teach them the errors that are around them, doctrinal and religious errors, because they're going to be confronted with that sooner or later. And if they're not prepared for it, they can be shaken to the very core foundation of their faith. And so what we're trying to do here is consider our children to be on loan by God. God says here, I'm going to allow you to have these children. You're going to work in concert with me in bringing life into the world. I'm giving you a huge responsibility. You cooperate with me in this process of bringing life into the world, and here are my expectations for you as parents. I want you to teach them about me. I want you to teach them about themselves in regard to me. I want you to teach them about my word. I want you to teach them about the devil and the threat that he is. I want you to teach them about forgiveness and their need for it. I want you to teach them about eternal life. I want you to help them grow up to be the kind of adult that hopefully and prayerfully they will then choose to be my children. That is a huge burden of responsibility. It cannot be taken lightly. You can't just phone it in. You can't just walk out on it. You can't just turn it over to your wife, or a wife turn it over to her husband and the father of the children. How much more time, effort, sobriety would we bring to this task if we always kept in the forefront of our mind, first and foremost, our children are spiritual beings. They are on loan from God, and I want to try to give them back to God with a spiritual foundation underneath them. Well, point number 5, children who become adults, if parents do their job right, the time is going to come to release our children, to let go of them. It is a painful time for parents. It's a painful time this time of the year, even with COVID. We have parents that are taking their children to school and saying goodbye to them. It's a highly emotionally charged time. It's a rite of passage. It's a watershed moment. Call it what you will, but it can be very traumatizing for a parent. It might be exciting and somewhat intimidating for a child. But as we begin to see our children truly taking their first steps of independence, it's very unnerving, but it is natural. God does not give us our children forever. He gives us our children to bring them to independence. And this is what God intended for it to be. Parents to have children for a period of time, bringing them then to their own independence. Sometimes, however, we can be reluctant to turn loose as parents. We can cling to them too tightly. And this is a prime way to cause our children to resent us. If we as parents cannot let go, if we keep hanging on and binding our life up in the lives of our children, look, there's nothing wrong with grandparents being grandparents. There's nothing wrong with grandparents babysitting on occasion. There's nothing wrong with spending family time. But when it becomes a matter of dependence, that parents are dependent upon their children and grandchildren for their life's focus, it can create resentment and a desire to pull away from parents, which is exactly what the parents are not wanting to happen, but they can actually cause it by clinging too tightly. And so we might find our children distancing ourselves if we don't give them room, if we don't trust them, if we don't give them space, if we continually want to micromanage their lives and overly be part of their lives, we may find that will backfire on us. So we must accept the limitations of parenthood, and there are limitations in that. Our children are going to grow up to develop their own value systems and make their own decisions, be responsible for their own behavior, which is what we're trying to raise them to do. But I find, too, that some parents are still trying to work out their own guilt, their sense of inadequacy in raising their children. They feel heavy about the mistakes they've made as parents, and they see their adult children perhaps making bad choices, and they tat upon themselves here. Every parent, there are no exceptions. Every parent is going to make mistakes in raising their children, period. We're humans. We're weak. We don't have the foresight and insight that we need. We get tired. We get distressed. There are all kinds of things that come upon us in our weakness, even as parents. And we're going to make mistakes. But here's a thought that freed me in this regard from being overly guilt-ridden about my mistakes with my children. That is simply that we don't need to be perfect. There's one perfect father, that's God, but we don't need to be perfect. And I think our children would tell us that. Our children don't expect perfection. They expect consistency. They don't want to hear us preach one thing and then see us do another. They don't want to see us holding fast to the rule on one occasion and then ignoring it on another occasion. But our children, I think, would be the first ones to tell us that they understand that we make mistakes, and we did make mistakes. My mother made mistakes raising me. I don't remember a whole lot about my father. One mistake he did make when I was little was he had me hold on to the, I don't know what you call it, the electrode part of the lawnmower that's supposed to attach to the spark plug. And he kind of gave the cord a little pull so I would understand what electricity felt like. I wasn't too happy with him about that. But nonetheless, my mother made her own mistakes in pretty much being a single parent from the time I was 10 on. I didn't expect perfection out of my mother. And especially now that I'm an adult parent, I certainly didn't expect perfection. What I expected and wanted to see out of my mother was genuineness and diligence and caring and loving. And I got that from my mother. But I didn't get perfection. None of us do. And so I think we parents need to do the best we can while we have our children and they're malleable. But there comes a point in time where we have to let go and say, you know what I've done, I've done. I tried to do well, but I wasn't perfect. And not punish ourselves too much. And I think our children will understand that unless we were just outright abusive or neglectful. And then it may be that there's some baggage that needs to be dealt with. But if a parent's conscientiously trying to do their best in nurturing and guiding and teaching their child, they don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be perfect. If we make mistakes, like any other relationship, let's correct those mistakes and move on. Psalm 127, verses 3 through 5. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is his reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. They've done their job well. They have strength behind them. Their children are a testament to them. They testify to their maturity. And so our children, when they grow up properly according to the nurture and development that we've tried to give them, will be a benefit and a strength and an aspect of caring for us as we get older. Mothers and fathers sacrifice much throughout their lives, their earlier youthful lives, for the sake of their children. It's only right that children then return that blessing when their parents get older and step in and do what they can to help them. In a job well done, children are nurtured by attentive, caring, loving parents who discipline, teach, and encourage their children to love God, respect authority, find a productive niche in society. Parents hopefully can enjoy their grandchildren and receive strength from an extended family as they age, get older, and perhaps become more dependent. Well, not every family situation reaches this ideal. I'm aware of that. But it's a goal to work toward. It's a goal for young parents to work toward. It's when your children are 3, 4, 5, 6, it's difficult to envision them married on their own, having their own children. That seems like a long, long way off. Well, believe me, it'll come quicker than you think. I know you've heard people say that before. I'm going to tell you that again. It's going to happen quickly. And you will wish you would have done your utmost when you had the opportunity with them at home. So looking down the road, if you can envision them married and having their own children, and you in your 50s, 60s, perhaps later in your 70s, what would you like your family to look like then? Would you like to see unity and cohesion and love coursing throughout the family, grandparents, children, grandchildren? It's going to take an investment of our time and energy, our prayers, discipline, teaching, time. It's going to take an investment of all of that in order to help our children become what we would like to see them be, yes, but more what God would like them to see. Well, let's talk just for a few minutes. We're almost out of time about a few of our questions here. Number one, poor Eli. He's always the example of a bad father. The quintessential example, I suppose. There were a lot of other bad fathers in Scripture, but there are a couple of things said about Eli that make him such a good reference. How did Eli honor his sons more than God? And how might parents do so today? Well, Eli allowed his sons to corrupt the sacrifices that were being brought to the tabernacle. They were taking more than what they rightfully could take. They were, worse than that, sleeping with women who came to the door of the tabernacle. This is in 1 Samuel 2, verse 22. And then in the condemning thought, I think, that comes in all of this is in 1 Samuel 3:13, where God is speaking to Samuel about Eli. And he says, his sons did all of these things, and Eli did not restrain them. We do find an example in chapter 2 of Eli verbally stating his disapproval of his sons, But God says he did not restrain them. He did not step in with the parental authority that he needed to and put a stop to it. And so in that sense, Eli was very weak. Not sure how Samuel turned out to be as good as he was, because if you remember, his mother, Hannah, brought him to be raised in Eli's household when he had just been weaned. I don't know if Eli learned any lessons or he had tutors or nursemaids or whatever dealing with him at a younger age. But Samuel certainly turned out to be a much better child than Hophni and Phinehas. But then it appears Samuel didn't do such a good job with his own children. So how might we honor our children today more than God? Well, it may be that we too don't restrain them, that we see them do things that are wrong and we're just weak and we don't confront that and deal with it. And so we can nurture our children in the wrong way by withholding from them the discipline that they need. And so, like Eli, we can make a big mistake by over permissiveness. And in that neglect, we can see our children grow up to be out of control, and we've got absolutely no influence with them, as it appears Eli did not have. Question 2, a modern trend is to have children later in life. As the median age for marriage goes up, obviously the median age for having children, unless they were born out of wedlock, which certainly happens. What are some pros and cons of this? Well, I'm not sure how many pros there are. I had a hard time with that one myself. I said, number one, financial resources might be greater. If you wait later, you might be more stable in your career and have more money in the bank, be able to deal with things financially a little bit better. Or maybe you're a little bit older, you have more life experience, you've lived through some things, you've grown up a little bit. Again, according to psychologists, the male mind now is not maturing until about 27 years of age. I'm not sure about the female mind, probably younger. But, if you're having children at 22, 23, 24, it may be that you're not where you need to be mentally yet. You're not stabilized. Maybe, maybe not. Depends on the individual to some degree. But, there might be some pros to waiting later. I think there might be more cons. It may be that the longer you wait, the less energy you have. And certainly as grandparents, Melanie and I have commented to each other many times over, God gives little children to younger people for good reason. As we get older, we just can't get on the floor and do puzzles, like we used to. Or it may be as a con that the children are separated from the parental growth itself. And this kind of sounds counterintuitive, but there is something about growing up with your child, learning as your children are learning. And I've often said, those that have heard me preach some on this subject, your first child is not given to you as practice. Even though you don't have any true hands-on parental skill with your first child, God expects you to do a good job with that child. They're not a throwaway. They're not just practice. And so we need to be learning along with that child, even if we have a child at 19, 20, 21. Maybe we're lacking some life experience, but number one, we're going to gain some by raising that child. And number two, we need to be open to our own deficiencies as we raise our children. Well, let's go on. Number 3, we're about out of time here. What are common ways of failure in the spiritual training of our children? I would say number 1 is depending on the church to do it for us. When we come together for Bible classes in a local church, those Bible classes are extremely important. I don't want to detract from that at all, but it is supplemental. Parents are given the primary responsibility of teaching their children about God and His Word. That's where the lion's share of the work needs to be done. And so it may be that we neglect that because we rely on the congregation's teaching in order to help our children learn. Well, it may be that we fail to make Bible study. Secondly, we fail to make Bible study exciting and desirable for our children, interesting and intriguing. there are so many different things available to children on computers and online that are colorful and exciting, that have graphics and visuals that spark their imagination. And if we're just plodding along with an outline, for our children, or we're not trying to communicate with them, not that we should just mimic the world, but when our children are being raised on a variety of colorful and intriguing imagery, we're going to have to up our game to make Bible study interesting to them, fun, on their level, fun and intriguing and interesting, getting into the stories. You've got to feel that in order for your child to feel it coming from you. And so it may be that we neglect that somewhat. It may be that we just neglect our children, that we just don't spend time with them that we need to studying the Bible. Obviously, that's a failure in spiritual training. It may be that we wait too long to begin it. We're waiting for them to get older, and Satan isn't waiting. And so it may be that we make a mistake of waiting too long. Sometimes we can introduce things to our children too early, too young. But then sometimes I think we just wait too long, and we think that children aren't mature enough to handle certain things. But I'll tell you, our children are being exposed to a lot of things, especially if they're in a public school setting. They're being exposed to a lot. And if we don't understand that as parents, we might want to be more diligent to understand what they are getting in the public school setting. But Satan doesn't usually wait. He likes to get in as early as possible, and we need to counter that. Well, we also need to model our faith, not merely make the teaching instructional and verbal, but we need to be living that faith consistently before our children. And if we're not, they'll figure that out. And it may be that we fail to teach our children the hard lessons. We can't just sort of keep it up here on the surface. We've got to dig down deeper and introduce our children to some of the more difficult things of life. Again, age appropriate, but push that envelope a little bit. They can usually handle more than we think they can. I'm not going to get into number 4. We're out of time. Might be something you can discuss in your own family with your own spouse on your own. But this concludes, again, our study of the heart of the matter. I have emailed out for Sunday evening's live stream the first lesson of the Gospel of Mark. That's where we're going to be going starting Sunday evening. Thanks for hanging in there with us for all 21 of these lessons. Again, this is not where we intended to go as a congregational study, but COVID has changed a lot of things, so this was sort of a last-minute plug-in. But I do hope it's been helpful and insightful to you. Again, these are sort of conversation starters. We didn't go into great depth on any of them. But hopefully they've been helpful to you. Thanks for tuning in tonight, and we'll see you all soon. Have a good rest of the weekend.